Almost everyone assumes there were no female Nephilim. It's one of those ideas that feels so obvious that few people ever stop to question it. We read Genesis 6, encounter the mysterious Nephilim, and immediately picture towering male warriors striding across the ancient world. Giant kings, giant hunters, giant conquerors. But there is a problem. The Bible never actually says that. In fact, if you read the passage carefully, you may notice something surprising. Genesis tells us about the sons of God. It tells us about the daughters of men. It tells us about the Nephilim. Yet nowhere does it explicitly state whether female Nephilim existed or not. And that silence creates one of the most fascinating mysteries in all of Scripture. Were there daughters among the Nephilim? Did giant women once walk the earth alongside their infamous male counterparts? Or does the Bible's silence itself hold a deeper meaning? Tonight, we're going to investigate one of Genesis's most overlooked questions. Not by adding to Scripture, not by inventing myths, but by carefully examining what the text actually says and what it carefully leaves unsaid. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries of the Bible are not hidden in the words we read, they're hidden in the spaces between them. Genesis chapter 6 opens with one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible. As humanity multiplied across the earth, a mysterious event occurred. The text says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for themselves. Then Genesis delivers a statement that has sparked debate for thousands of years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 4 verses. Miha, only 4 verses. Has Motel? Yet entire libraries have been written trying to understand them. Who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? What kind of beings were born from these unions? The debate has never truly ended. Some scholars argue that the sons of God were fallen angels. Others believe they were human rulers. Others see them as descendants of Seth, intermarrying with the line of Cain. Each interpretation has passionate defenders, but regardless of which position someone takes, one fact remains. The Nephilim are presented as a distinct group associated with extraordinary power, fame, and influence. And this is where our mystery begins. Notice something about the passage. Genesis never says, the Nephilim were all male. It never says, only sons were born. It never says, no daughters existed among them. Most readers simply assume this, because later biblical references focus almost exclusively on male figures. But assumptions and statements are not the same thing. The text itself remains silent. That silence becomes even more interesting when we consider the meaning of the word Nephilim. The Hebrew word appears only a handful of times in the Bible. The Mede one, its exact meaning remains debated. Some connect it to a root meaning, to fall. Others interpret it as referring to mighty warriors, men. Still others connect it with giant stature. I've got people. Ancient translators struggled with the term as much as modern scholars do. The Greek Septuagint translated Nephilim as gigantes, giants. Kamitelas, that translation shaped centuries of interpretation. Yet kento. As a result, when most people hear the word Nephilim, they imagine enormous male warriors towering over ordinary humans. But here's an important question. Is that image coming directly from Genesis? Or is it coming from traditions built around Genesis? Because if we strip away centuries of assumptions and return to the text itself, we discover that Genesis provides remarkably little information about the biological makeup of the Nephilim. The passage focuses on their existence, their reputation, their influence, their connection to a mysterious event before the flood. But it says almost nothing about their internal society, nothing about families, its head, nothing about daughters, nothing about women, most of them nothing about marriage among their own kind, nothing about how their lineage continued. It's as if the biblical author deliberately shines a flashlight on one small part of a much larger picture. And everything beyond that beam remains hidden in darkness. The deeper we investigate, the stranger the silence becomes. Think about it. If the Nephilim were a genuine population rather than a handful of isolated individuals, basic biology suggests there would have been both males and females. Populations do not continue through male descendants alone, and many of the communities do not emerge from a single gender. Lineages do not expand without women. Yet Genesis offers no explanation. There are no details, no clarification. Nothing. The silence has caused some researchers to propose that female Nephilim almost certainly existed, even if Scripture never specifically mentions them. Others argue that the absence of female references indicates they were not significant to the narrative. Still others caution against drawing any conclusions at all. And perhaps that's exactly where the mystery becomes most powerful, because the Bible often records events with extraordinary selectivity. The modern readers sometimes forget this. We expect detailed biographies. Ancient writers often had different priorities. The biblical authors were not attempting to satisfy modern curiosity. They were communicating theological truths. Their focus was purpose, not completeness. And that distinction matters enormously. Consider how many important women throughout biblical history are never named. Noah's wife remains unnamed. The wives of Noah's sons remain unnamed. Many daughters mentioned in genealogies receive no further description. Entire generations pass through Scripture with only the briefest acknowledgement. The Bible frequently records the existence of people without preserving details about them. In other words, absence from the narrative does not necessarily mean absence from reality. This principle becomes crucial when discussing the possibility of female Nephilim, because Genesis may simply be following the literary conventions of its time. The narrative's purpose is not to provide an exhaustive census of pre-flood humanity. Its purpose is to explain humanity's growing corruption before divine judgment. Everything else remains secondary, and that realization leads us toward an even deeper question. If female Nephilim existed, why might ancient writers have ignored them? The answer may lie not in theology, but in history itself. Throughout the ancient Near East, historical records overwhelmingly focused on men. Kings Dimenshit, warriors, Mayan, priests, Bremdis men, conquerors, Mini-Plain, military leaders. These were the figures considered worthy of preservation. Women often remained invisible in official records unless they held extraordinary status. As a result, countless women undoubtedly lived, influenced events, raised families, and shaped history without ever having their names recorded. Could the same pattern explain the silence surrounding female Nephilim? Perhaps. But before we jump to conclusions, another mystery waits ahead. Because Genesis is not the last place giant bloodlines appear in Scripture. Long after the flood, The Bible introduces new groups associated with unusual size and strength. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, Shakspray, the Zamzumim, Shitoble, and their existence creates a puzzle that may be even more difficult to solve than the original mystery itself. Because if the flood destroyed all life except those aboard Noah's Ark, how did giant lineages appear again? That question has haunted biblical interpreters for centuries. And as we will soon discover, some of the answers lead directly back to the possibility of women whose names Genesis never recorded. Before we try to answer whether female Nephilim existed, we need to confront a fact that many modern readers overlook. The Bible is not a modern history book. It was not written to satisfy every question future generations might ask. In many cases, it records only the details necessary to communicate a specific message. Entire lifetimes are compressed into a single sentence. Decades disappear between chapters. Countless individuals pass through history without leaving behind even a name. And nowhere is this more evident than in biblical genealogies. When most people think of biblical family records, they imagine long lists of fathers and sons. Adam fathered Seth. Seth fathered Enosh. Enosh fathered Kenan. And generation after generation unfolds like a chain stretching through time. But hidden behind those names is an obvious reality. Every one of those sons had a mother. Every generation depended on women. Yet many of those women remain completely invisible within the text. Consider Noah. Noah is one of the most famous figures in human history. His story occupies multiple chapters. We know details about his obedience, his faith, his family, and his covenant with God. But what was his wife's name? The Bible never tells us. The woman who survived the flood, the woman who helped preserve humanity, the woman who lived through one of the most extraordinary events ever recorded. Her name remains unknown. The same pattern appears again and again. The wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth are never named. Many daughters mentioned in genealogies receive little or no further attention. Some appear briefly and vanish from the narrative forever. This does not mean they were unimportant. It simply means the author was focused elsewhere. The biblical narrative often follows specific covenant lines, inheritance lines, or leadership lines. Because of this, countless individuals remain outside the spotlight. Now consider what that means for the Nephilim. Genesis 6 contains only a few short verses. Its purpose is not to document Nephilim society. It is not describing their culture. It is not providing a family tree. It is not cataloging every member of their population. Instead, it is establishing the spiritual and moral context leading to God's judgment upon the earth. The author is concerned with corruption, rebellion, and the escalating wickedness of humanity. Everything else remains secondary. If female Nephilim existed, would Genesis necessarily mention them? Not at all. In fact, given the literary style of the passage, their omission would not be surprising. Ancient readers may never have considered the question significant. Modern readers ask it because we instinctively seek completeness. We want details. We want explanations. We want every gap filled. Ancient writers often had different priorities. And that difference creates fertile ground for mystery. Imagine reading an account thousands of years from now that mentions a powerful ruling dynasty. The text discusses kings, generals, and warriors. No queens are named. In slaughter, no daughters are listed. 7. No female members are described. Would that automatically prove no women existed within the dynasty? Of course not. Okay, it would simply reveal the author's focus. The same principle may apply to Genesis Schultean. The more closely we examine the passage, the more apparent it becomes that silence cannot automatically be interpreted as denial. And yet there is another reason this mystery refuses to disappear. Because Genesis is strangely selective about what it chooses to tell us. The chapter introduces one of the most mysterious groups in biblical history. Too known, a group that has fascinated theologians, historians, archaeologists, and storytellers for centuries. Double, yet it provides almost no details. No physical descriptions, no social structure. No explanation of daily life. No information about women. And no information about children. No information about family relationships. No. The author seems almost uninterested in the very questions that fascinate modern readers. It's as though we have discovered a fragment from a much larger story. A fragment whose missing pieces have been lost to time. A plan. And this brings us to an uncomfortable possibility. What if female Nephilim existed in significant numbers, but their existence simply wasn't relevant to the biblical author's purpose? That possibility cannot be proven, but neither can it be dismissed. The text simply doesn't provide enough information, which leaves us standing at the edge of uncertainty. And uncertainty is where many of the Bible's greatest mysteries live. But the mystery becomes even deeper when we move beyond Genesis. Because the Nephilim are not the last giant-like beings mentioned in Scripture. Centuries later, Israel encounters groups whose descriptions sound strangely familiar. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Mehas, the descendants of giant clans. Basis. When the Israelite spies entered Canaan, they returned terrified. According to Numbers 13, they reported, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The spies specifically connected these giants to the Nephilim. Whether that connection was literal, symbolic, exaggerated, or theological remains debated. But the statement itself raises an enormous question. How could giant bloodlines exist after the flood? If every Nephilim perished in Noah's day, where did these later giants come from? Over the centuries, scholars have proposed several answers. Some suggest another supernatural incursion occurred after the flood. But others believe the spies exaggerated what they saw. Still others interpret giant language symbolically. Yet among the many theories lies one of the most controversial possibilities of all. What if the bloodline survived through women? What if the answer to the post-flood giant mystery isn't found among the famous male warriors Scripture records, but among women Scripture never mentions? At first glance, the idea sounds speculative, and it is put in. Yet it emerges naturally from the questions Genesis leaves unanswered. If giant ancestry passed through generations, women would inevitably play a role. No lineage survives without them. No family tree continues without them. No bloodline moves through history without mothers. And suddenly the silence becomes impossible to ignore. Because every giant king recorded in Scripture had a mother. Every Anakite warrior had a mother. Every Rephaim descendant had a mother. The text may focus on men, but biology does not project, which means that hidden behind every giant lineage stands an entire population of women whose stories were never told. Were some of them descendants of the Nephilim? We don't know, The Bible never says Egefam, but neither does it say otherwise. And that uncertainty leads us directly into the most controversial territory of all. Because outside the Bible itself, ancient Jewish traditions preserved stories that expanded far beyond Genesis, and stories involving watchers, Medu, fallen angels, but headed forbidden knowledge, ancient giants, and perhaps clues to questions that Scripture itself leaves unanswered. Whether those traditions preserve genuine memories or later speculation remains hotly debated. But what they reveal about ancient thinking may surprise you, and in some cases, the answers they offer are stranger than anyone expects. The deeper we travel into this mystery, the stranger the landscape becomes. Because Genesis presents the Nephilim as a pre-flood phenomenon. Yet the Bible's giant problem does not end with the flood. In many ways, it begins there. After the waters receded and humanity started again through Noah's family, one would expect the giant bloodlines to disappear forever. The flood was meant to be a complete reset. The old world was gone. The corruption of that age had been judged, and so human civilization would begin anew. At least, that's what many readers assume. But then we arrive in the books of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Samuel. This shouldn't happen, and suddenly, giants are back. Not just one giant Misman. Entire giant populations, entire giant territories, entire giant bloodlines. Just angely, the Israelites encounter names that sound almost mythical. Gubati, the Anakim, there's the Rephaim. She believed them, the Emim, the Zamzumim. These are not described as isolated individuals. They appear as recognizable groups known throughout the ancient Near East. Some are feared by neighboring nations. Others are remembered in regional traditions. Still others become symbols of overwhelming strength and terrifying size. The most famous moment occurs in Numbers 13. Moses sends 12 spies into the Promised Land. For 40 days they explore the territory. When they return, their report shocks the nation. Most of the spies describe cities fortified beyond imagination and inhabitants of extraordinary stature. Do not more than some. Then comes one of the most debated statements in Scripture. How to get? There we saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Enoch, who come from the Nephilim. The statement immediately raises questions. Were these truly descendants of the original Nephilim? Were the spies speaking literally? Were they exaggerating their fear? Were they using a familiar term to describe unusually large people? Scholars have debated these possibilities for centuries. But regardless of how the passage is interpreted, one fact remains. The Israelites clearly associated certain giant clans with the ancient Nephilim tradition, and that creates a serious theological puzzle. If the flood destroyed all life outside Noah's Ark, how could any connection to the Nephilim still exist? Over time, several major explanations emerged. The first theory is often called the second incursion theory. According to this view, whatever event produced the Nephilim before the flood happened again afterward. Supporters argue that Genesis 6 contains the intriguing phrase, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." For some interpreters, those two words, "and also afterward," suggest later manifestations of the same phenomenon. Under this model, post-flood giants result from a second supernatural rebellion. The theory has fascinated readers for centuries, yet many scholars reject it because the Bible never explicitly describes a second event. That the evidence remains indirect. The second explanation argues that the spies exaggerated. This interpretation points out that the 10 fearful spies delivered an unreliable report in several places. They portrayed themselves as grasshoppers. They focused on obstacles rather than God's promises. Perhaps their references to the Nephilim was simply part of that exaggeration. According to this view, the giant clans were real, but the connection to Genesis 6 was rhetorical rather than biological. Again, the debate continues. Then comes a third possibility. Then, one that often receives less attention, but raises fascinating questions. The survival hypothesis. This theory proposes that some aspect of the giant lineage survived through Noah's family itself. Various versions exist. Some focus on genetics, others focus on family ancestry. Others remain intentionally vague. Most lack strong biblical support. Yet they continue to appear because interpreters struggle to explain how giant traditions persist after a worldwide catastrophe. And this is where the possibility of female descendants enters the conversation. Let's be clear, the Bible never states that giant bloodlines survived through women. There is no verse that explicitly teaches such a scenario. But neither does Scripture explain how post-flood giant traditions emerged. As a result, some researchers have suggested that women may represent one of the missing pieces in the puzzle. Think about the problem from a purely genealogical perspective. Every bloodline passes through both men and women. Every family tree branches through mothers as well as fathers. Yet ancient records overwhelmingly emphasize male ancestry. But as generations unfold, female lines often disappear from written documentation. Their genetic contribution remains hollow. Their historical visibility vanishes. This pattern occurs throughout ancient history. Entire populations can carry ancestry through maternal lines, while official records focus exclusively on fathers. If something similar occurred in the biblical world, then tracing unusual ancestry becomes far more complicated. Could ancient giant traditions have survived through women whose names were never recorded? Theoretically, yes. Can it be proven? No. Dame, and that distinction is essential. The goal is not to force a conclusion. The goal is to recognize the limits of what the text actually reveals, because too often discussions about the Nephilim become more certain than the evidence allows. The truth is that Genesis leaves enormous gaps, and those gaps invite speculation. Some careful foolers, some reckless doors homes, some fascinating butters. Some deeply problematic publiment. The female line hypothesis belongs in that category. It is not doctrine. It is not established fact. It is an attempt to explain questions that Scripture leaves unresolved. Yet even if the theory proves incorrect, it highlights something important. Every giant mentioned in the Bible had a mother. This king of Bashan had a mother. And the Anakim had mothers. Both. The Rephaim had mothers. Indeed, the warriors defeated by David and his mighty men had mothers. The biblical narrative rarely discusses them, but their existence is unavoidable. And once you realize that, the silence surrounding female figures becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Perhaps the authors considered them irrelevant. Perhaps cultural conventions pushed them into the background. Or perhaps the biblical writers simply focused on the individuals most important to the story they were telling. Whatever the reason, an entire hidden world exists behind the text. The video bereavement, a world populated by unnamed wives, unnamed daughters, unnamed mothers. They're people whose existence is required by the narrative but whose stories remain untold. And that observation prepares us for the final layer of our investigation. This is because outside the Bible, ancient Jewish traditions attempted to fill many of these gaps. The Book of Enoch, Second Temple writings, Venture, early interpretations of Genesis, legends about watchers and giants, and some of these traditions became incredibly influential. Others were rejected, but together they reveal something remarkable. Ancient readers were asking many of the same questions we ask today, and some of the answers they imagined were more terrifying than anything found in Genesis itself. By now, one thing should be clear. The Bible never explicitly mentions female Nephilim. The statement, but it never explicitly rules them out either. And it is precisely that silence that has fueled centuries of speculation. Long after Genesis was written, Jewish scholars, scribes, and storytellers began wrestling with the same unanswered questions. Who were the Nephilim? How were they connected to the sons of God? What happened to them after the flood? And perhaps most importantly, what details had been left unsaid? Among the most influential ancient writings to address these mysteries was the Book of Enoch. Although not part of the biblical canon for most Christian traditions, Enoch became enormously influential during the Second Temple period. Its ideas shaped how many ancient Jews understood Genesis 6. In Enoch's retelling, a group of heavenly beings known as the Watchers descended to earth. They took human wives. They taught forbidden knowledge, and their actions unleashed chaos upon the world. The resulting offspring were described as giants whose violence consumed the earth. The story expands dramatically beyond the few verses found in Genesis. Yet something interesting happens. Even in Enoch, the narrative focuses overwhelmingly on the male giants, when the emphasis remains on power, violence, destruction, rebellion. The same pattern appears again. The spotlight stays fixed on male figures. Women remain largely in the background. Why? Perhaps because ancient cultures often measured influence through warfare and political power. Perhaps because giant warriors generated stronger storytelling imagery. Number 4, or perhaps because the traditions themselves evolved within male-dominated societies that naturally emphasized male characters. Whatever the reason, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. The giants are remembered. That the women connected to them are largely forgotten. And yet, traces of the missing half of the story seem to linger around the edges. The mystery becomes even more fascinating when we compare biblical traditions with stories from other ancient cultures. Across the ancient world, legends of giant beings appear with surprising frequency. In Greek mythology, the Titans challenged the gods. Gigantic beings shaped primordial history. Some of these stories included powerful female figures. In Mesopotamian traditions, semi-divine heroes emerged from unions between gods and humans. In Canaanite mythology, supernatural bloodlines often appeared within royal traditions. Of course, these stories are not scripture. They cannot be treated as biblical evidence, but they reveal something important about the ancient imagination. The idea of extraordinary hybrid lineages was widespread, and in many of those traditions, women played significant roles. Today, this raises a fascinating question. If surrounding cultures imagined both male and female members of supernatural lineages, why would the Nephilim be different? Again, we don't know. The Bible simply doesn't tell us, and perhaps that uncertainty is intentional. Modern readers often want absolute answers. The biblical text sometimes refuses to provide them, not because the authors were careless, but because their purpose was different from ours. So, Genesis was not written to satisfy 21st century curiosity. Its purpose was theological. This mood, the passage explains humanity's descent into corruption before the flood. It establishes the moral crisis that led to divine judgment. Everything else remains secondary. The identity of the Nephilim matters. Their exact biology does not. Before, the warning matters. John Paul, the mystery remains. And that may explain why Genesis offers so few details. The author was not trying to create an encyclopedia entry. He was describing a world spiraling toward catastrophe. In that context, the existence or non-existence of female Nephilim may simply have been irrelevant to the message being communicated. Yet for later generations, the question persisted, because humans are naturally drawn toward mysteries, especially biblical mysteries, and especially the ones that remain unresolved. And few questions remain more unresolved than this one. Were there female Nephilim? The honest answer may disappoint those searching for certainty. We don't know. No. The Bible never says yes. The Bible never says no. The evidence simply runs out. At that point, interpretation gives way to speculation, and speculation must remain speculation. But there is an important distinction between saying something is unknown and saying something is impossible. Many people speak as if female Nephilim could not have existed, yet Scripture never makes that claim. Others speak as if female Nephilim definitely existed. Scripture doesn't make that claim either. 2. The truth lies somewhere between confidence and caution, between curiosity and humility, between what has been revealed and what remains hidden. And perhaps that is exactly where this mystery was always meant to remain. Payoff. The question Genesis leaves open. After examining the text, the traditions, and the theories, we arrive at a surprisingly simple conclusion. Female Nephilim are never explicitly mentioned in Scripture, but they are never explicitly denied either. Genesis leaves the question open. The passage provides just enough information to spark curiosity, just enough information to inspire debate, just enough information to remind us how much of the ancient world remains hidden from view. Perhaps there were female Nephilim, perhaps there were not. Perhaps entire stories have been lost to history. Or perhaps those details were never important to the biblical message in the first place. What we do know is this: the Bible consistently focuses our attention on God's response to corruption, rather than on satisfying every historical question we might ask. The mystery of the Nephilim ultimately points beyond the Nephilim themselves. This movie, it points toward the limits of human knowledge. Licit, toward the humility required when approaching ancient texts. Toward the realization that not every question receives a complete answer. And maybe that is what makes this subject so fascinating. Because the most unsettling mysteries in Scripture are often not the things God chose to reveal. They are the things He chose not to explain. The daughters of the Nephilim, if they existed, remain hidden behind the veil of history. Unnamed, unrecorded. A no-with condition. Yet, their absence continues to provoke questions thousands of years later. Questions that Genesis never fully answers. Questions that continue to echo through every generation of readers. This type, and perhaps that lingering uncertainty, is itself part of the story. So, what do you think? Did female Nephilim once walk the earth? Or does the Bible's silence suggest a different explanation entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy exploring the deepest mysteries of Scripture, Don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey into the forgotten corners of the ancient world.